November 1836. The low country of South Carolina held its breath between seasons, neither summer nor winter. Just damp gray days when fog rolled off the Ashley River and settled into the rice fields like something living. This was the kind of weather that made people tell ghost stories, the kind that made enslaved people speak in whispers about things that should not be possible, about free men who vanished in northern cities and reappeared in southern chains, about documents that could erase a person's entire existence with a single forged signature, about conspiracies so vast, so profitable, so protected by powerful men that speaking the truth out loud could get you killed. Rosewood Plantation sat on 1,200 acres of profitable land 12 miles north of Charleston. Its owner, Edmund Hartwell, was everything a successful planter should be. Educated at Harvard, connected to Charleston's oldest families through his marriage, refined in his tastes, collecting rare books and French wines, generous to his church, kind to his horses, and absolutely ruthless in extracting maximum profit from the 147 human beings he claimed as property. His daughter Margaret was 23 years old in that November of 1836, and she carried a secret that could destroy her family and get her killed. For 6 years, she had been teaching enslaved children to read in a hidden room behind the plantation library. Not out of some grand abolitionist conviction, not because she thought slavery was wrong. She had grown up accepting it as natural as breathing, but because of something her mother told her before dying of yellow fever when Margaret was 16. "Your father is not the man you think he is." Her mother had whispered this from her deathbed, gripping Margaret's hand with surprising strength for someone so close to death. The books in his study, the ledgers he keeps locked away, if you ever find them, if you ever read them, you will understand that everything we have is built on something far worse than you know. Promise me you will look. Promise me you will know the truth, Margaret had promised. And 1 month after her mother's burial, she had picked the lock on her father's private cabinet and found ledgers that made no sense. Names, dates, locations, but not purchases of slaves through normal channels. These were different. Detailed descriptions of men and women, their ages, their skills, their literacy levels, their former occupations, merchant, blacksmith, teacher, seamstress, and next to each name, a location: Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore, free cities, northern cities. At 17, Margaret had not understood what she was looking at. It took 2 more years of careful observation, of listening to conversations her father thought she could not hear, of noting patterns in the new arrivals at Rosewood before the full horror became clear. Her father was not just a plantation owner. He was part of a network that kidnapped free black people from northern states, forged documents declaring them escaped slaves, and sold them into permanent bondage in the Deep South. It was monstrously illegal, breathtakingly profitable, and protected by judges, sheriffs, ship captains, and politicians who took their cut of the proceeds. The realization had shattered something in Margaret. Not enough to make her speak out. She was still her father's daughter, still protective of her own survival, but enough to make her do something. If she could not free the people her father enslaved, she could at least give them the tools to possibly free themselves someday. Reading, writing, knowledge. So she had started teaching in secret, choosing only children, only those who could be trusted, only those whose parents understood the risk and accepted it anyway. And then, in November 1836, her father brought home a man who would change everything. His name, according to the bill of sale, was simply Thomas. No last name. Described as approximately 30 years old. Skilled in carpentry and mathematics, quiet temperament. Purchased from a dealer in Richmond who specialized in quality stock. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a covered wagon with 5 other newly purchased slaves. Margaret watched from the house as they were unloaded, assessed, assigned to quarters. She noticed Thomas immediately because of the way he moved. Most newly arrived enslaved people, especially those sold from Virginia South, carried themselves with either broken resignation or barely concealed fury. Thomas carried himself like someone visiting a place he found distasteful but would tolerate temporarily. Like someone who knew this was all a mistake that would be corrected soon. That night at dinner, Edmund Hartwell was in excellent spirits. He had paid top dollar for Thomas, he told Margaret, but it was worth it. The man could do advanced mathematics, could read architectural plans, could manage complex construction projects. They would finally be able to complete the new cotton gin house that had been planned for 2 years. "He can read then?" Margaret asked carefully, cutting her roasted duck into precise pieces. Her father nodded. Previous owner educated him for usefulness. "It is not ideal. Literacy creates problems, but the skills outweigh the risk. He will be kept separate from other slaves to prevent contamination. You are not to interact with him. Why are you telling me this?" Margaret kept her tone merely curious, not challenging. "Because he is handsome, and you are unmarried, and I will not have gossip about my daughter and a slave." Her father's voice carried an edge despite the pleasant words. "You understand me, Margaret?" "Perfectly, father." She understood far more than he realized. 3 days later, Margaret broke her father's order. She found Thomas in the carpentry workshop behind the main barn, working alone on plans for the new gin house. She had waited until her father left for Charleston on business, until the overseer was occupied with the rice fields, until the house slaves were busy with afternoon tasks. She knocked on the workshop door, unusual enough that Thomas looked up with surprise. "You should not be here, miss." His voice was educated. Northern accent. Pennsylvania, maybe, or New York. Nothing like the speech patterns of enslaved people born into bondage in the South. Margaret stepped inside and closed the door. "I know." She moved to the work table where plans were spread out. "These are impressive. You have real training. I had training." Thomas's correction was subtle but deliberate. "Past tense. Where?" He studied her for a long moment, calculating risk. "Philadelphia. I studied with a master carpenter for 6 years. Had my own shop for 3 more before I made the mistake of traveling to Baltimore." The pieces clicked together in Margaret's mind with sickening clarity. "You are free. I am free. Present tense. This is illegal. I was drugged in Baltimore, woke up in chains in Virginia, sold south with forged papers claiming I was an escaped slave from a North Carolina plantation that does not exist. But I have proof. Letters from clients in Philadelphia, documents showing my business, testimonies from men who knew me. I have been trying to get word north for 4 months, but no one will carry letters for a slave, and I cannot escape without knowing exactly where I am or how to navigate this region." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret whispered. "I could go to my father right now. You could, but you will not." Thomas tapped the architectural plans. "These specify measurements in metric units. The French system. Your father ordered these plans drawn and assumed I would not notice or would not care. But no southern plantation owner uses metric. These plans were drawn by someone educated in Europe. And the scale is wrong for a cotton gin house. This is designed as secure storage for something else. Documents, perhaps. Valuable papers that need protection from fire and moisture." Margaret's pulse quickened. "You figured that out from architectural plans?" "I figured it out because I notice things. Like the fact that you speak differently to house slaves than your father does. Like the fact that you have ink stains on your right hand that suggest regular writing. But ladies of your class do not typically maintain correspondence so extensive. Like the fact that 3 slave children in the quarters can write their own names in the dirt, which should be impossible unless someone is teaching them." Cold fear flooded through Margaret. "You are threatening me. I am proposing an alliance." Thomas set down his pencil. "Your father is building a secure structure to hide documents he cannot afford to have discovered. I need those documents because they will contain evidence of his illegal activities, including possibly records of where I came from. You need those documents because they will tell you the full extent of what your father is involved in. And we both need to survive long enough to use that information. Why would I betray my own father?" Thomas looked at her steadily. "Because you already know something is wrong. Because you are already committing treason against your class by teaching reading. Because you have been looking for a way to act on what you suspect, but you have not known how. I am offering you how." Margaret should have left. Should have gone straight to her father. Should have had Thomas whipped for daring to speak to her as an equal. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me exactly what you think my father is doing. Tell me everything. Before I answer, before we uncover the twisted truth about what really happens at Rosewood Plantation, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. Trust me, you will want to follow this story to its shocking conclusion. Now let me tell you exactly what Thomas discovered, and how Margaret's world was about to shatter completely. Thomas had been watching, listening, and documenting everything since arriving at Rosewood 5 weeks earlier. He spoke with the methodical precision of someone trained in evidence and argument, someone who understood that proof mattered more than passion. Your father does not operate alone. There is a network spanning from Maryland to Louisiana, at least 20 men actively involved, probably more in supporting roles. They target specific types of free black people, skilled tradesmen, literate individuals, people with resources who can be sold for premium prices. The process is systematic. They identify targets in northern cities, usually through corrupt informants who frequent black churches, markets, mutual aid societies. Once identified, the target is drugged, typically with laudanum in their drink at a tavern or boarding house. They wake up in chains, often on a ship already heading south. By the time they are conscious enough to protest, they are days away from any jurisdiction where their freedom could be verified. How do they maintain the deception? Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. Documents. Forged bills of sale claiming the person is actually an escaped slave. Forged affidavits from fictional slave owners in southern states. Corrupt judges in border cities who sign rendition orders without investigation. The victims try to protest, try to prove their identity, but who do authorities believe? A respected white businessman with official papers, or a black person in chains claiming to be free? The outcome is predetermined. Margaret felt ill. How many people? I do not know total numbers, but based on what I have observed here, your father processes at least 8 to 10 people per year through his portion of the network. He keeps them separated, prevents them from communicating with other slaves who might help them, works them in isolation until their spirit breaks or they accept their fate. Most are then sold deeper south where recovery is impossible. I was designated for keeping because of my skills. He saw her expression. Yes, Miss Hartwell. I said processes, like goods in a warehouse, because that is what we are to him. Inventory. The workshop was silent except for rain beginning to patter on the roof. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely audible. In his locked cabinet, the ledgers I mentioned. Would they contain proof of this? Almost certainly. Names, origins, sale prices, destinations. Men like your father keep meticulous records. They must, to manage the distribution network and ensure everyone receives proper payment. It is a business, Miss Hartwell, and businesses require accounting. Then we need to get those ledgers. Thomas shook his head. Not enough. Ledgers could be dismissed as forgeries created by disgruntled slaves. We need corroborating evidence, letters, bills of lading from ships, testimonies from multiple sources. We need enough that even men with power cannot simply bury the truth. Where would such evidence be? Your father is building a secure structure. Those plans you saw are designed for document storage, specifically for papers that cannot be kept in the main house where fire or theft is possible. My guess is the network maintains centralized records somewhere, proof of transactions that protect all members should anyone consider betrayal. If such records exist, they would be valuable enough to warrant special construction. The new cotton gin house. Margaret's mind raced. But it is not finished. Construction barely started, then we have time to plan. Thomas leaned forward. But I need to know your commitment level, Miss Hartwell. Are you willing to destroy your father? To potentially face legal consequences yourself? To give up your inheritance, your social position, everything you have known? Because that is what exposing this network will cost you. Margaret thought about her mother's dying words. About 6 years of teaching children to read in secret. About the faces of people her father had processed through Rosewood, faces she had ignored, preferring comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth. She thought about Thomas, who should be running his own carpentry business in Philadelphia, who should be free, who instead measured wood for a building designed to hide evidence of his own illegal enslavement. What would you do? She asked. If our positions were reversed, if you could walk away safely, would you? Thomas smiled grimly. If I could walk away, I would run straight to Philadelphia and try to rebuild my life. I would probably never think about Rosewood Plantation or you again. But my position is not reversible with yours, Miss Hartwell. I cannot walk away. I can only fight or submit. He paused. The real question is what you will do, having the freedom to choose. Margaret stood and walked to the workshop window, looking out at the November rain falling on Rosewood's fields. Somewhere out there, 147 people lived and worked in bondage. Some born enslaved, accepting it as the natural order. Others, like Thomas, stolen from freedom and trapped in a nightmare backed by legal fictions and institutional corruption. Her father had built his wealth, her family's position, on systematic kidnapping and fraud. and she had benefited from it every day of her life. I choose to fight. She turned back to Thomas. Tell me what we need to do. Over the following weeks, they developed a careful plan. Margaret would continue her normal routines while gradually getting closer to her father's private papers. Thomas would work on the new building while subtly sabotaging construction to extend the timeline, giving them more opportunity to gather information. They would meet only when absolutely safe, communicating otherwise through coded notes left in the library, where Thomas now had access for measuring materials. The first major breakthrough came on December 3rd. Edmund Hartwell had guests for dinner, 3 men from Charleston discussing business over brandy and cigars. Margaret played the perfect hostess, serving refreshments, smiling politely, appearing utterly uninterested in their conversation. But she listened carefully. The Richmond source is becoming problematic. One of the men, a banker named Gideon Wells, spoke with frustration. He is demanding larger shares and threatening to expose the operation if not satisfied. Then we find a new source. Edmund's voice was calm. Richmond is useful but not irreplaceable. Baltimore has potential. Philadelphia sources remain productive. What about the latest batch? Any problems? Margaret poured more brandy, keeping her hands steady despite her racing pulse. One required persuasion. The mathematics fellow kept insisting he was free, had documents proving it. We handled it appropriately. The documents? Destroyed. And I ensured he understands the consequences of continued resistance. Edmund accepted a fresh cigar. He is valuable enough to keep. His skills justify the trouble. They were talking about Thomas. Margaret forced herself to show no reaction. The third man, Judge Carvel, someone Margaret recognized from her father's political circles, spoke up. We need to accelerate the documentation centralization. Too many members keeping independent records creates vulnerability. The planned facility at your plantation, Edmund. When will it be operational? Spring. Perhaps late March if weather cooperates. Thomas is proving capable despite his attitude. Keep him in line. We cannot afford disruptions now. Judge Carvel drained his brandy. I have 3 cases currently before my court. Abolitionists filing habeas corpus petitions for people they claim are illegally enslaved. The petitions lack merit, but they demonstrate increased scrutiny. We must be more careful. Careful, yes, but not paralyzed. Edmund leaned back, utterly confident. We have operated successfully for 12 years. We have protection at every level of government. We have eliminated problems before they became threats. This network is too profitable, too well connected, too necessary to the regional economy to be seriously threatened. Margaret excused herself, claiming fatigue. Once in her room, she immediately wrote everything she had heard in careful cipher, using a code Thomas had taught her based on his Philadelphia business correspondence. The next morning, she left the notes in their designated location, a hollowed-out volume of French poetry her father would never touch. Thomas's response came that afternoon. 3 words slipped between pages of another book. Documentation. Judge Carvel. Margaret understood immediately. A judge involved in the conspiracy would have legal documents, court records that could corroborate the ledgers, evidence from an independent source that would be harder to dismiss. But accessing a judge's private papers would be exponentially more dangerous than searching her own father's study. She spent 2 days considering approaches before opportunity presented itself. Judge Carvel's wife, Adelaide, invited Margaret to a ladies' tea on December 8th. The invitation specified an afternoon affair while the judge attended court in Charleston. Margaret accepted immediately. The Carvel home was elegant, filled with expensive furniture and imported decorations. 8 women gathered for tea and gossip, discussing fashion, upcoming holiday social events, servant problems. Margaret played her role perfectly, contributing just enough conversation to seem engaged, while her mind worked on the real problem. Adelaide, what beautiful bookcases. Margaret commented during a lull in conversation, gesturing toward the judge's visible study through open double doors. Are those all legal volumes? Adelaide laughed. Those are my husband's precious law books. He jokes they are worth more than I am. Absolutely forbids anyone from touching them. Even the house girl only dusts under his supervision. How thoroughly organized. Margaret kept her tone casually impressed. My father's study is chaotic by comparison. Organization is everything in legal matters. Adelaide's pride was evident. Carvel maintains files on every case, cross-referenced by date, type, and defendant. He can locate any document within minutes. Margaret filed this information away and returned her attention to the tea party, but her mind raced with implications. Cross-referenced files meant systematic documentation, which meant possible records of every falsified slave case Judge Carville had handled. That evening, she wrote Thomas a detailed note describing the study layout, the filing system, Adelaide's protective attitude toward the books. His response came the next day. "We need inside the house." "Not possible for me." "Must be you." Margaret knew he was right. A black man, enslaved or free, could never simply enter a judge's home unsupervised. But a respectable white woman paying an afternoon social call? That was entirely normal. She spent 3 days crafting the perfect excuse and executing her plan. On December 12th, she returned to the Carville home in the late afternoon, carrying a basket of preserves and an apologetic expression. "Adelaide, I am so embarrassed. I left my grandmother's brooch here during the tea. I realized it only this morning. Might I look in the parlor where we sat?" Adelaide, flustered by unexpected company and in the middle of directing dinner preparations, waved her toward the parlor. Of course. Please, look wherever you need. I must check with Cook. She has been impossible today. Excuse me just a moment." The moment Adelaide disappeared into the kitchen, Margaret moved quickly to the study. The filing cabinets were exactly as described. She scanned labels, looking for any category that might contain what she needed. Criminal cases, property disputes, rendition hearings. That would be it. Cases involving the return of escaped slaves across state lines. She pulled open the drawer, her hands shaking slightly. Inside were dozens of files, each labeled with a name, date, and brief description. She pulled out 3 at random and scanned them quickly. Petition for writ of habeas corpus denied. Defendant's claim of free status unsupported by credible documentation. The language was nearly identical across all 3 files. Different names, different dates, but the same outcome every time. And in the margins of each file, handwritten notes in what must be Judge Carville's hand. Payment received as discussed. Network facilitation fee. Margaret heard footsteps. Adelaide returning. No time to replace the files properly. She shoved them back into the drawer, pushed it closed, and moved swiftly to the parlor, grabbing a sofa cushion and pretending to search beneath it. Found it. She called out, holding up the brooch she had deliberately brought from home. It had fallen behind the furniture. Oh, good. Adelaide appeared in the doorway, relieved. "I would have felt terrible if we lost your family heirloom. May I offer you tea before you go?" Margaret declined gracefully, made her excuses, and left. Only when she was safely in her carriage did she allow herself to shake with reaction. She had not gotten physical copies of the files, but she had seen enough. Judge Carville was not just protecting the network through favorable rulings. He was being paid for it. Facilitation fees, payments for denying legitimate habeas corpus petitions filed by free black people trying to prove their status. That night, she shared everything with Thomas during a carefully orchestrated encounter in the library, where he was supposedly taking measurements for new bookshelves. "This is substantial," Thomas said quietly, his eyes sharp with intensity. "A sitting judge accepting payment to deny legitimate legal claims. This goes beyond kidnapping. This is systemic corruption of the justice system itself. But we still do not have physical proof," Margaret pointed out. "I saw the files, but I cannot testify about them. Who would believe a woman's testimony against a respected judge? Then we need the files themselves. Or we need testimony from someone whose voice cannot be easily dismissed." Thomas paused. "Tell me about your father's business associates. Who visits Rosewood regularly? Who might have access to his correspondence?" Margaret thought carefully. Her father's business agent, Marcus Finley, came monthly to review accounts. The family attorney, Jonathan Pierce, visited quarterly. Various merchants and suppliers rotated through for routine business. And every 6 weeks, like clockwork, a man named Abraham Coulter visited late at night, staying for several hours before departing before dawn. Abraham Coulter. She said slowly, "I have never been told his purpose. Father describes him as handling sensitive transactions. But he arrives after everyone is asleep and leaves before breakfast. They meet in Father's study with the door locked." Thomas's expression sharpened. "Describe him. Age, appearance, manner of dress. Perhaps 50 years old. Well-dressed but not flashy. Northern accent, possibly New York. He carries a leather document case that never leaves his person. And Father treats him with unusual deference, almost nervousness. Coulter is the coordinator." Thomas spoke with sudden certainty. "Every network like this needs someone who manages information flow, coordinates between different regional operations, ensures no single member becomes too powerful or too exposed. Your father answers to him. If that is true, then Coulter would have documentation of everything. The entire network operation? Yes. And the new secure building your father is constructing? My suspicion is that it is meant to be a regional archive for Coulter's network. Centralized records stored at Rosewood because your father's plantation is isolated enough for security but accessible enough for the major conspirators, which means they will move records here from wherever they are currently. Kept exactly. Thomas leaned closer, voice dropping to barely a whisper. When is Coulter scheduled to visit next? December 28th. Father mentioned it at dinner last week, 2 weeks from now. Just after Christmas. Probably planning to bring records for storage once the building is complete. He looked at Margaret intently. We need to be ready. When Coulter comes, we need to intercept him before he reaches the house, or we need to access his documents during his visit. That is impossible. He stays locked in Father's study the entire time. Then we make it possible. Thomas's jaw set with determination, because this might be our only opportunity to get evidence comprehensive enough to actually destroy the network. Miss Hartwell, I need you to trust me with something. I need you to help me escape. Margaret felt her stomach drop. You want to run? No, I want you to help me escape temporarily, deliberately poorly, so I get caught. Then, when your father has me punished, you insist on tending my injuries personally, which establishes precedent for you entering the quarters. That gives us a channel for moving information and creates plausible reason for future interaction that your father cannot easily forbid without appearing unusually cruel to his daughter's sensibilities. The plan was manipulative, risky, and dependent on her father reacting exactly as Thomas predicted. It was also clever. This will require me to lie to my father. To manipulate him deliberately. You have been lying to your father for 6 years, teaching children to read in secret, Thomas said bluntly, but not unkindly. This is simply a different type of deception in service of a larger goal. He was right. Margaret had already crossed that line years ago. The only question was how far she was willing to go. When should we do this? Tomorrow night. Full moon, good visibility. I will head toward the river, make enough noise to be noticed, allow myself to be caught within a half-mile. Your overseer will bring me back and recommend harsh punishment. Your father will likely agree. Then you intervene. What if he refuses my intervention? He will not. Thomas's confidence was absolute. Men like your father have predictable patterns. He prides himself on his reasonableness, his measured approach. If you appeal to his vanity, frame your request as both humanitarian concern and practical resource management. You will not be able to afford to lose a skilled carpenter due to permanent injury. He will accept it as evidence of his own enlightened management. You have thought about this carefully. I have thought about little else since arriving here, Miss Hartwell. Every conversation, every interaction, every observation has been calculated toward this goal. Survival requires strategy. Freedom requires patience. Justice requires both. The next night unfolded exactly as Thomas predicted. The alarm went up at midnight. The overseer, a brutal man named Cooper, dragged Thomas back to the main house within 40 minutes. Margaret, awakened by the commotion, came downstairs in her nightgown and robe as her father emerged from his room. Attempted escape, sir, Cooper reported with satisfaction. Caught him heading toward the river. Wants me to make an example, do so. Edmund's voice was cold. 20 lashes minimum. Ensure the other slaves witness it. Father, wait. Margaret's timing was perfect, voice concerned but not hysterical. Thomas is your most skilled carpenter. The gin house project requires his expertise. If Cooper's punishment causes permanent damage to his hands or back, you will lose months of work and considerable value. Edmund considered this. Cooper, clearly disappointed, waited. She is not wrong, Edmund said finally. 10 lashes. Enough to communicate consequences, but not enough to impair function. And Cooper, avoid the hands and shoulders. Margaret pressed her advantage. Father, might I tend his injuries afterward? I have medical supplies, and it would be wasteful to risk infection in such a valuable asset. The framing was perfect. Not humanitarian concern for a suffering person, but practical resource management. Edmund nodded. Fine. See that he heals quickly. The gin house must be completed by spring. The punishment was brutal despite the reduced number. Margaret forced herself to watch from the house window as Thomas was tied to the whipping post, and Cooper delivered 10 savage lashes that opened deep cuts across his lower back. Thomas made no sound, refusing to give Cooper the satisfaction. When it was done, he was cut down and half carried to the quarters. Margaret waited exactly 1 hour before approaching with her medical bag. The slave quarters were segregated. Thomas kept in a small cabin separate from others as her father had specified. She knocked softly before entering. Thomas sat on the edge of a rough bed, shirtless, his back a mess of blood and torn flesh. He looked up as she entered, his face gray with pain, but his eyes sharp and aware. "That was the performance," he said quietly. "Now we see if it was worth the cost." Margaret set down her bag and began cleaning the wounds with steady hands despite her churning stomach. "It was worth it. You were right about everything. Father agreed to my involvement." "Good. Now when Coulter arrives in 2 weeks, you can plausibly be in the quarters checking on my continued recovery. That gives us opportunity." As Margaret worked, applying salve and clean bandages, she felt the full weight of what they were doing settling onto her shoulders. This was no longer abstract planning or information gathering. This was real conspiracy with real consequences. Thomas had just taken 10 lashes as part of their strategy. What would the cost be when they actually tried to steal Coulter's documents? What would happen if they failed? But Thomas had already paid a price far higher than 10 lashes. He had lost his freedom, his business, his entire life because of her father's network. Whatever risks Margaret faced, they were nothing compared to what Thomas risked every single day simply existing in chains. "Tomorrow I will bring better bandages and willow bark for pain," she said quietly, finishing her work. "And I will begin planning exactly how we intercept Abraham Coulter." Thomas nodded. "We have 2 weeks. Let us use them well." The 2 weeks before Abraham Coulter's scheduled arrival passed in careful preparation disguised as routine. Margaret visited Thomas daily, ostensibly to monitor his healing. Her father approved this arrangement with barely concealed satisfaction, pleased that his daughter understood the importance of protecting valuable property. He had no idea that during each visit, behind closed doors in Thomas's isolated cabin, they were planning the systematic destruction of everything Edmund Hartwell had built. Thomas's back healed slowly, the lash marks forming raised scars that would remain permanently. He never complained, treating the pain as simply another variable to manage. His mind remained razor-sharp, focused entirely on their goal. During Margaret's visits, they spoke in careful whispers, developing contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. The secure building, what Edmund called the gin house, but what they knew was meant for document storage, progressed exactly as Thomas had designed it to progress, which was slowly. He had built deliberate flaws into his work, mistakes subtle enough to pass initial inspection, but significant enough to require correction. A foundation that settled unevenly. Roof supports cut slightly wrong, requiring replacement. Window frames that did not quite fit their openings. Each error bought them additional time. On December 15th, Margaret learned something that changed their timeline dramatically. She was helping arrange her father's study for a meeting when she noticed a letter on his desk, still sealed but with a return address she recognized. Abraham Coulter, New York. She memorized the address, then carefully used steam from a kettle to lift the seal without breaking the wax, a trick her mother had taught her years ago for reading her father's correspondence without detection. The letter's contents made her blood run cold. Edmund. The Philadelphia situation has become complicated. Federal authorities are investigating disappearances of free black citizens, and certain informants have become unreliable. I am accelerating the timeline for centralization. I will arrive December 20th, not December 28th as originally planned. I will bring all Northern Regional documentation for immediate storage in your facility. Construction must be completed by my arrival. I cannot risk maintaining these records in vulnerable locations any longer. Additionally, I am bringing 3 new acquisitions for processing through your operation. All are highly educated, high-value targets. One is a teacher, one a physician, one a shipping clerk. The teacher and physician have families actively searching for them, which creates risk. They must be moved south quickly after breaking. Ensure Cooper understands the necessity of rapid psychological submission. I have no patience for extended resistance with these 3. Confirm receipt of this letter immediately. A.C. Margaret carefully resealed the letter and placed it back exactly as she had found it. Then she went directly to the library and left an urgent coded message for Thomas in their designated book. 8 words. Coulter arrives early. December 20th. Bringing 3 people. Building unfinished. Thomas's response came within hours, tucked into a different volume. Continue normal behavior. I have contingency. But Margaret could see the problem clearly. December 20th was only 5 days away. The secure building was nowhere near complete, which meant Coulter would either delay his arrival after all, or he would need to store his documents somewhere else temporarily. The most logical location would be Edmund's study, which had a fireproof safe. If Coulter's complete archive went into that safe, accessing it would become exponentially more difficult, and 3 new people being brought for processing. 3 free individuals who would be drugged, beaten, broken, and sold south into permanent bondage. The teacher and physician had searching families. There would be habeas corpus petitions, newspaper advertisements, inquiries. The network would crush all of it with forged documents and judicial corruption, just as they had crushed every previous attempt at justice, unless Margaret and Thomas stopped them. That evening at dinner, Edmund was tense and distracted. He barely touched his food, and when Margaret asked if something troubled him, he waved off her concern. Business complications. Nothing for you to worry about. His tone discouraged further questions. After dinner, he went directly to his study and remained there for hours. Margaret heard him moving around, opening and closing cabinets, the distinctive sound of the safe being operated multiple times. He was preparing for Coulter's early arrival, making space for the documents. At midnight, after the house had settled into silence, Margaret slipped out to Thomas's cabin. This was dangerous visiting him at night, but necessity outweighed caution. She knocked their signal, 3 soft taps, pause, 2 more taps. Thomas opened the door immediately, fully dressed despite the hour. He had been expecting her, December 20th. She said without preamble. 5 days. What is your contingency? We take the documents during Coulter's arrival, not after. Thomas moved to the small table where he had been working by candlelight. I have been mapping the timeline. Coulter will arrive in the evening, your father's usual preference for sensitive meetings. He will bring the documents in his document case. They will meet in the study, likely for several hours while reviewing contents. During this time, the documents will be most vulnerable. How? They will be in a locked study with 2 men. We cannot simply walk in and demand them. No, but we can create a situation that forces them to evacuate the study while leaving the documents behind. Thomas spread out a rough sketch of Rosewood's main house layout. The study has 1 window, east-facing. The stable is approximately 50 yards east of the house. If a fire were to break out in the stable during their meeting, a serious fire threatening to spread, they would evacuate the house to coordinate response. Protocol would be to secure valuables, but in chaos, with multiple crises happening simultaneously, priorities become confused. You want to burn the stable. I want to create a controlled fire that appears to threaten the main house but actually does not. Enough smoke and drama to force evacuation, not enough to cause genuine catastrophe. While your father and Coulter are outside organizing response, you enter the study, take the documents from Coulter's case, and hide them. Where would I hide documents that substantial? We are talking about possibly hundreds of pages. You hide them in the one place no one would look. In your father's own filing cabinets mixed with his legitimate business papers. We do not need to remove them from the house immediately. We just need to separate them from Coulter so he cannot simply retrieve them and leave. Once hidden, we have time to plan proper extraction. Margaret considered the plan. It was audacious, dependent on precise timing, and required multiple things going exactly right. It was also probably their best option, the 3 people Coulter is bringing. What happens to them? Thomas's jaw tightened. If we succeed in taking the documents, we create enough chaos that processing them becomes impossible. Your father will be too focused on managing the crisis and searching for the missing archive. That might buy them time, might allow them to escape or be discovered. But I cannot promise their safety, Miss Hartwell. I cannot even promise ours. What if we simply freed them, let them escape during the fire? 3 newly arrived captives, still drugged or restrained, unfamiliar with the area, with no money and no knowledge of safe routes north. They would be recaptured within hours, and their escape would trigger immediate intensive investigation. We would be discovered, so we sacrificed them to protect our plan. Thomas met her eyes steadily. Yes, that is exactly what we do. Because 3 people suffering now versus potential liberation of dozens or hundreds in the future. The mathematics are brutal, but they are clear. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist there must be another way. But she knew he was right. They could not save everyone. They could barely save themselves. The best they could hope for was gathering evidence strong enough to eventually destroy the network, which might prevent future kidnappings even if it could not undo past ones. "I hate this," she said quietly. "So do I. But hatred does not change necessity." Thomas began rolling up his sketch. "We have 5 days. I need you to gather supplies. Lamp oil, rags, anything flammable that will not be missed. Store them in the stable's feed room where I can access them. On December 20th, when Coulter arrives, I will be in the stable preparing. You will be in the house ready to act when you see smoke. Do you understand?" "Yes." Margaret turned to leave, then paused. "Thomas, what happens after? If we succeed, if we get the documents, what do we do with them?" "We disappear, both of us. We take the evidence north to Philadelphia, to abolition societies that will know how to use it. We testify, we provide documentation, we destroy these men legally and publicly. And then we live with whatever consequences follow. My father will hunt us. The network will hunt us. Yes, which is why we must be thorough and quick. Once we move, there is no turning back, no hesitation, no mercy. We burn everything down, Miss Hartwell. Your father, Judge Carvel, every man connected to this conspiracy. We turn their carefully constructed system into ash and ruin. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about her mother's deathbed plea. About 6 years of teaching children to read in secret. About Thomas's family lost in Philadelphia. About 3 people arriving in 5 days who would be processed like cargo. About the 147 enslaved people at Rosewood, some stolen from freedom, others born into chains, all suffering under the weight of her family's wealth. "I am prepared," she said firmly. Let them burn. The next 5 days were excruciating in their normalcy. Margaret maintained her routine perfectly, attending church on Sunday, receiving social calls from neighboring plantation ladies, practicing piano, reading in the library. She played the role of dutiful daughter so convincingly that Edmund actually commented on how much more pleasant she had become lately, not difficult or questioning as she had been in her younger years. If you only knew, Margaret thought. Smiling sweetly and agreeing with whatever he said, she gathered supplies carefully, taking small amounts from different locations so nothing would be missed. A can of lamp oil from the storage room claiming she needed it for her bedroom lamps. Rags from the laundry, saying she wanted to polish furniture in her room. A box of matches, purchased during a trip to the general store for other items. Each component innocuous on its own, collectively deadly when combined with intention. Thomas worked on the building during daylight hours, now suddenly finding ways to accelerate progress. He wanted Edmund to believe completion was possible before Coulter arrived. Wanted him feeling confident rather than anxious. A confident man made mistakes. An anxious man stayed vigilant. On December 18th, 2 days before Coulter's scheduled arrival, the 3 kidnapped victims arrived at Rosewood. Margaret was in the house when the covered wagon pulled up to the rear entrance, away from public view. Through her window, she watched as 3 figures were unloaded, all shackled, all clearly drugged or beaten into submission. 2 men and 1 woman. The woman was young, perhaps Margaret's age. She moved with the mechanical compliance of someone whose spirit had been recently crushed. One of the men, older with graying hair, still had defiance in his posture despite the chains. The physician, Margaret guessed. Educated, respected, stolen from his life and thrust into nightmare. The third person was younger, early 20s, and he was weeping silently as Cooper dragged him toward the quarters. Margaret felt rage so intense it nauseated her. These were not abstractions in ledgers. These were real people, stolen from real lives, suffering real terror. And her father was orchestrating it. Her father, who sat across from her at dinner each evening. Her father, who had raised her, educated her, provided for her. Her father, who was fundamentally, irredeemably monstrous. That night, she barely slept. She lay in her bed thinking about the woman in the quarters, wondering if she had children somewhere searching for her. Wondering if the physician had patients who depended on him. Wondering if the young man had been planning his future, imagining accomplishments, before being drugged in some northern city and waking up in southern hell. December 20th arrived gray and cold, temperature dropping toward freezing. Edmund was energized at breakfast, actually humorous, making small talk about Christmas preparations. He seemed to have no awareness that his daughter was planning his destruction, that the enslaved carpenter he trusted with his special building had been methodically sabotaging everything for weeks, that tonight his entire operation would begin collapsing. Men like her father never expected resistance from those they considered beneath them. That blindness was their weakness. Abraham Coulter arrived at 7 o'clock that evening, precisely as scheduled. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as his carriage pulled up to the main entrance. He emerged carrying the leather document case Thomas had described, clutching it protectively as he greeted Edmund. They exchanged brief conversation on the front steps, then disappeared into the house. Heading directly to the study, Margaret gave them 20 minutes to settle in, to begin their review of documents, to relax into the illusion of security. Then she moved to the hallway outside the study and listened at the door. "The building is not ready." That was Coulter's voice, tense with frustration. "You assured me it would be completed. The carpenter has accelerated work." Edmund sounded defensive. "It will be ready within 2 weeks, 3 at most. Meanwhile, my safe is secure. We can store everything there temporarily." "I do not like this. Too many documents in one location without proper security. If there were a fire, a theft, a raid, there will be none of those things." Edmund interrupted. "You are being paranoid, Abraham. Rosewood is isolated, protected. Nothing will happen." Margaret slipped away from the door and moved to the rear of the house, exiting through the kitchen where the house slaves were preparing dinner. None of them questioned her presence. They never did. White people had freedom to move anywhere, question anything, examine everything. It was one of 1,000 small privileges Margaret had never consciously acknowledged until partnering with Thomas. The stable was dark, lit only by a single lantern hanging near the entrance. Margaret slipped inside and moved toward the feed room where she had stored the supplies. Thomas was already there, working by touch in the darkness. "Ready?" he whispered. "Ready." Margaret's heart hammered, but her hands were steady. Thomas had prepared everything with his usual precision. Rags soaked in lamp oil, arranged in specific locations to create maximum visible smoke with minimal actual fire danger. He had even positioned water buckets strategically so the fire could be controlled quickly once it served its purpose. This was not about destruction. It was about theater. "When I light this," Thomas said quietly, "you have approximately 3 minutes before your father exits the house. Move quickly. Take only what you need from Coulter's case. Hide it immediately. Do not take time to examine what you are grabbing. Just take and hide. Understand?" "Yes. If anything goes wrong, if they catch you, you know nothing about the fire. You were worried about the horses, came to check on them, discovered the blaze. Pure coincidence, I understand." Margaret paused. "Thomas, if we fail, we will not fail. But if we do, at least we tried. At least we fought back. That is more than most people can say." He struck the match. The fire caught quickly, oil-soaked rags igniting with surprising speed. Smoke billowed immediately, thick and dark, pouring toward the stable's open doors and windows. Thomas had calculated everything perfectly. Maximum visible drama, minimum actual danger. The horses began to panic, their whinnying loud enough to carry to the main house. Margaret ran. Out of the stable, across the yard, entering the house through the kitchen door, just as she heard her father's study door open and his voice raised in alarm. "Fire! The stable is on fire!" She reached the study seconds after Edmund and Coulter rushed out toward the commotion. The door was open, the room empty, Coulter's document case sitting on the desk exactly where he had left it in his panic. Margaret grabbed it and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were folders, loose papers, bound documents. No time to examine. She grabbed 3 thick folders from the top, then 3 more from the bottom, then 1 from the middle. 7 folders total, as many as she could carry concealed under her shawl. She closed the case, left everything else exactly as it had been, and fled the study. The hallway was empty, everyone outside dealing with the fire. She ran to her room and shoved the folders under her mattress, then composed herself and went outside, playing the role of concerned daughter awakened by crisis. The scene was perfectly orchestrated chaos. Slaves running with water buckets, Edmund shouting orders, Coulter standing beside him, still clutching his document case, which he had apparently gone back for after his initial panic. The stable produced impressive smoke but relatively little flame. Within 20 minutes, the fire was contained, leaving minimal actual damage. As the excitement died down, Margaret heard Cooper reporting to Edmund. "Looks like lamp oil spilled in the feed room, sir. Might have been careless with the lantern. Investigate thoroughly tomorrow." Edmund's voice was sharp with stress. "We could have lost everything." Coulter was examining his document case, checking the contents. Margaret held her breath, waiting for him to notice the missing folders. But the case still contained substantial material. In the dark, in the chaos, with his focus divided, he apparently did not realize several folders were gone. "Everything accounted for?" Edmund asked. "Yes." Coulter's voice was tight. "But this confirms we need proper storage immediately. I will not tolerate this level of risk. The building will be ready. I guarantee it." They returned to the house, talking in low, urgent voices. Margaret waited outside a few more minutes, then retired to her room, claiming exhaustion from the stress. Once alone, she pulled the folders from under her mattress and began examining what she had taken. The first folder contained correspondence between Coulter and various network members across the South. Letters discussing specific operations, naming names, describing methodology. This alone would be devastating evidence. The second folder was financial records. Payments made, profits distributed, expenses for bribes and facilitation fees. A complete accounting of the network's economy. The third folder contained detailed profiles of victims. Not just names and origins, but full descriptions. Previous occupations, family information, literacy levels, sale prices, final destinations. Dozens of people, each reduced to data points in a ledger of human trafficking. Margaret felt tears welling, but forced them back. No time for emotion. She needed to hide these immediately, somewhere they could survive even if her room was searched. She remembered Thomas's advice. Hide them in plain sight, mixed with legitimate papers where they would be overlooked. She crept downstairs to her father's study. The house had settled back into quiet. Edmund and Coulter apparently retired for the night. She slipped into the study and moved to the filing cabinets where Edmund kept business correspondence, legal documents, property records, all meticulously organized by category and date. Margaret distributed the stolen folders throughout the existing files. Coulter's letters mixed with routine business correspondence. Financial records inserted into her father's account ledgers. Victim profiles filed with property assessments. Each folder separated, each set of papers distributed, making them nearly impossible to find without knowing exactly what to look for. By 3 a.m, she was done. The evidence was hidden. She returned to her room and finally allowed herself to shake with reaction. They had done it. The first stage was complete, but she knew the hardest part was still coming. Coulter would eventually realize documents were missing. There would be investigation, suspicion, searches. The file would be examined more carefully. Questions would be asked, and somehow, through all of that, she and Thomas needed to survive, retrieve the hidden documents, and escape north with evidence intact. The next morning, Margaret woke to shouting from downstairs. She dressed quickly and descended to find absolute chaos in the study. Edmund and Coulter were tearing through papers, faces furious and frightened. Gone. 7 complete folders. Coulter's voice shook with rage. Philadelphia operations, financial records, victim documentation. Everything needed to prosecute the entire northern network. Someone took them during the fire. It had to be. Edmund's face was gray. But who? The slaves would not know what they were looking at, and no one else had access. He stopped, looking at Margaret standing in the doorway. "You." His voice was cold. "You were here last night. I was outside watching the fire with everyone else." Margaret kept her tone merely confused. "Father, what is happening?" "Papers are missing. Important business documents." Edmund moved toward her. "Did you enter my study last night?" "No." The lie came smoothly. "Why would I?" "Search her room," Coulter commanded. "Search it thoroughly." Edmund hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he nodded to the house slaves. "Do it. Now." Margaret stood in the hallway while her room was ransacked. They found nothing, of course. The evidence was not there. After 30 minutes, the slaves reported the room clean. Edmund dismissed them and turned to Margaret with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger, not even suspicion. Something colder. Calculation. "If I discover you had anything to do with this, daughter or not, there will be consequences you cannot imagine. I understand, Father." Margaret met his eyes without flinching. "But I promise you, I know nothing about your missing papers." She walked away with her head high, leaving them to their paranoid searching. In her pocket, hidden in the folds of her dress, was one page she had kept separate from the rest. A list of network members, 23 names with addresses and roles. She had memorized every word. The war had begun. And Margaret Hartwell was no longer simply her father's daughter. She was the weapon that would destroy him. The 3 days following the theft were the most dangerous of Margaret's life. Rosewood Plantation transformed into something resembling a military garrison under siege. Edmund hired additional overseers, men with hard faces and violent reputations. He instituted searches of all slave quarters, twice daily. He questioned every enslaved person individually about suspicious activity the night of the fire. He brought in a detective from Charleston, a man named Garrison who specialized in theft investigations. Coulter remained at Rosewood, refusing to leave until the documents were recovered. He moved through the house like a predator, watching everyone with cold suspicion. Margaret felt his eyes on her constantly, measuring, calculating, waiting for her to make a mistake. But she made none. She maintained her routine with absolute consistency. Morning walks in the garden, afternoon reading in the library, evening needlework by the fire. She was perfectly calm, perfectly innocent, perfectly boring. The performance of her life, delivered with flawless commitment. Thomas, meanwhile, endured the worst of the investigation. As the most recently acquired slave, as someone with proven intelligence and capability, he became the primary suspect. Cooper questioned him repeatedly, using methods that left new scars alongside the whip marks. But Thomas never broke. He maintained his story with unwavering consistency. He had been in the stable before the fire. Yes, checking his tools for the next day's work. He had smelled smoke, had shouted alarm, had helped fight the blaze. He knew nothing about any documents. He could barely read, he claimed, certainly not well enough to understand complex legal and financial papers. The lie about his literacy was crucial. If they suspected he could read at a sophisticated level, they might reconsider their dismissal of him as a suspect. So he played the role of barely educated slave, maintaining the deception that had protected him since arriving at Rosewood. On December 23rd, Margaret managed a brief encounter with Thomas in the library, ostensibly showing him measurements for shelves Edmund had ordered. They had perhaps 90 seconds alone. They found nothing, Thomas whispered, his face bruised from Cooper's interrogation. They tore apart every building, searched every slave, examined every inch of the grounds. Nothing. The documents are safe, Margaret confirmed quietly. Hidden exactly where you suggested. But Coulter is not leaving. He has delayed his return to New York indefinitely. Then we accelerate our timeline. We cannot wait. Every day increases risk of discovery. Thomas's eyes were intense despite his injuries. Christmas Day, your father will be distracted with traditional obligations. Most of the household will be occupied with celebrations. That is when we move. Move where? How? North, immediately. We take the documents and run. I have been cultivating a contact among the river workers, a free black man who operates a small cargo boat. For sufficient payment, he will transport us upriver to a point where we can access the railroad network. From there, we make our way to Philadelphia. What payment? I have no money of my own. Thomas's expression was grim. Your mother's jewelry. The pieces you keep in your room. They are worth enough. Margaret's mother's jewelry was her most precious possession, the only tangible connection to a woman she barely remembered. But sentiment meant nothing compared to necessity. I will bring them. What time Christmas Day? Midnight. The celebrations will be finished, the house settled. Meet me at the river dock. Bring only what you can carry, whatever clothing and supplies fit in one small bag. We travel light and fast. The 3 people Coulter brought. The teacher, the physician, the clerk. What about them? Thomas's jaw tightened. I have been thinking about them constantly. If we can free them without compromising ourselves, we do it. But our priority is the documents. Without that evidence, everything is meaningless. Margaret nodded, understanding the brutal calculation. Christmas midnight. I will be there. They separated quickly as footsteps approached. Margaret exited the library, passing Garrison, the detective, in the hallway. He watched her with professional suspicion, but she smiled politely and continued to her room without acknowledging his scrutiny. That night, she began her preparations. She selected clothing appropriate for travel. Practical dresses, warm cloak, sturdy boots. She gathered her mother's jewelry from its hiding place, a pearl necklace, emerald earrings, a gold bracelet set with rubies. Worth perhaps $800 total, enough to buy passage and supplies for the journey north. She also retrieved the hidden page with the network member list and carefully sewed it into the lining of her traveling cloak. If everything else was lost, this single document could still do devastating damage to the conspiracy. On Christmas Eve, the plantation went through the motions of celebration. Edmund hosted dinner for neighboring families, a tradition he maintained despite his current anxiety. Margaret played hostess perfectly, directing servants, making conversation, ensuring everything appeared normal. She laughed at jokes, discussed fashion and gossip with other young women, and showed no sign that in 24 hours she would vanish forever. Coulter attended the dinner, charming and sophisticated in his conversation, revealing nothing of his true purpose. Margaret studied him carefully, this man who coordinated the kidnapping and sale of free human beings. He looked entirely ordinary, well-dressed, educated, speaking knowledgeably about literature and politics. A monster wearing the mask of respectability so convincingly that no one questioned what lay beneath. After dinner, the guests departed and the household prepared for Christmas Day. Edmund seemed to relax slightly, the social obligations providing temporary distraction from his missing documents. He actually smiled at Margaret as they retired for the evening. "You managed that well tonight," he said with rare approval. "Your mother would have been proud." The comment was intended as kindness but landed like accusation. Her mother, who had begged Margaret to uncover the truth. Her mother, who had known what Edmund was and had tried to warn her daughter. Her mother, whose jewelry Margaret would use to fund their escape and destruction of everything Edmund had built. "Thank you, Father," Margaret said simply, and went to her room. She did not sleep. She lay in bed fully dressed beneath her nightgown, waiting for the house to settle into silence. At 11:30, she rose and carefully packed her small traveling bag. Clothing, jewelry, the hidden documents she had retrieved from their filing cabinet locations during a carefully planned moment when both Edmund and Coulter were occupied elsewhere. She had not been able to recover all 7 folders, but she had gotten 4, including the most crucial, the victim documentation and the financial records. At 11:50, she slipped out of her room and down the back stairs, avoiding the main hallways where Garrison had stationed himself overnight. The kitchen was empty, the house slaves long since retired to their quarters. She exited through the rear door and moved quickly toward the river. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead. Margaret could see her breath. She pulled her cloak tighter and hurried along the path toward the dock, her bag clutched against her chest. Thomas was already there, waiting in the shadows. He wore rough traveling clothes and carried a small pack. When he saw Margaret, relief flooded his face. "I was afraid you would not come," he admitted quietly. "I promised I would." Margaret handed him the jewelry. For passage, Thomas examined the pieces by moonlight, then nodded. "This will work. The boat is waiting 2 miles downriver at a less visible location. We need to move quickly." "Wait." Margaret grabbed his arm. "The 3 people. The teacher, physician, and clerk. Where are they being held?" "In the new building. Your father moved them there 2 days ago, using it for secure confinement even though it is not finished. Can we free them?" Thomas hesitated. "Freeing them endangers us. Every minute we delay increases our risk, I know, but we cannot leave them. Not after everything we have done. Not when we have the means to act." Thomas studied her face, then made a decision. 10 minutes. That is all the time we can afford. If we cannot free them in 10 minutes, we leave without them." They moved quickly toward the new building, approaching from the rear where shadows were deepest. The structure was nearly complete now, walls solid, roof finished, only interior details remaining. 1 door locked, 2 windows, barred. Thomas examined the lock with practiced eye. "I can pick this, but it will take time." "You watch for guards." Margaret positioned herself where she could see the main house and the path from the quarters. Her heart hammered as Thomas worked on the lock with a thin piece of metal he had concealed in his clothing. Seconds stretched into minutes. 1 minute, 2, 3, a sound from the main house. Margaret tensed. Someone moving on the 2nd floor. A lamp being lit. She could see silhouettes through the window. "Hurry," she whispered urgently. 4 minutes. 5. The lock clicked open. They slipped inside the building. The interior was dark, but moonlight through windows provided enough illumination to see 3 figures huddled in the corner, chained to wall supports. The woman and 2 men Coulter had brought. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them. "We are here to help you. We are going to free you." The woman stared at her with eyes that had lost all trust. "You are lying. This is another test." "It is not a test." My name is Margaret. This is Thomas. We are escaping tonight, and we are taking you with us. The older man, the one Margaret thought might be the physician, spoke carefully. If this is genuine, you should know our freedom will be discovered quickly. They will hunt us. I know, Margaret said, but we have evidence that can destroy the network that kidnapped you. We are taking that evidence north to authorities who will act on it. Come with us now, and you will be part of ending this system. Thomas was already working on their chains with the same tools he had used on the lock. What are your names? He asked as he worked. Daniel Morris. I was a physician in Philadelphia. The older man spoke first. Ruth Campbell. Teacher, New York. The woman's voice was hoarse. James Patterson. Shipping clerk, Boston. The younger man who had been crying when he arrived now sounded steadier, anger replacing despair. The chains came free. Thomas helped them stand, all three unsteady from days of confinement and minimal food. Can you walk? Margaret asked. We will walk, Ruth said firmly. We will crawl if necessary. Anything to escape this place. They exited the building and began moving toward the river path. But they had taken perhaps 50 steps when lights flared in the main house and a shout went up. The building. Someone is at the building. Run, Thomas commanded. Everyone run now! They fled down the path, 6 people crashing through underbrush in the darkness. Behind them, more shouts. Lanterns being lit, the alarm spreading. Margaret ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her skirts tangling around her legs, her bag banging against her side. She could hear the others breathing hard, footsteps pounding. Daniel was slower, his age and captivity affecting his stamina. James helped support him, practically dragging him forward. The path to the river seemed endless. Margaret's lungs burned. Her legs screamed. But terror drove her forward. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Cooper's voice, distinctive in its cruelty, shouting orders to other overseers. They broke out of the trees onto the riverbank. A small boat waited exactly where Thomas had promised, a single figure standing beside it. The free black boatman Thomas had arranged passage with. This is not what we agreed, the boatman said sharply, seeing 6 people instead of 2. This price does not cover. Here. Margaret threw him her entire jewelry bag. Take all of it. Just get us upriver now. The boatman caught the bag, felt its weight, and made his decision. Get in, quickly. They piled into the boat, a tight, desperate huddle. The boatman pushed off from shore and began rowing with strong, practiced strokes. The current caught them, and they moved swiftly into the river's center. Lanterns appeared on the shore. Edmund's voice roaring with rage. Stop! Return immediately, or I will have you all killed. The boatman rowed harder. They were perhaps 30 yards from shore now, moving quickly with the current. Margaret could see figures gathering on the bank. Cooper, Edmund, Coulter, Garrison, other overseers. Some had rifles. Down, Thomas shouted. Everyone get down! They flattened themselves in the boat as the first shot rang out. The bullet whined overhead, missing by feet. More shots followed, but shooting accurately at a moving target on water in darkness was nearly impossible. The boat continued downriver, the shots becoming more sporadic as distance increased. After 5 minutes, the shooting stopped. After 10, the lanterns on shore disappeared around a river bend. After 15, they allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive. Ruth was weeping silently. Daniel sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed. James stared back toward where Rosewood had disappeared, his face twisted with emotions Margaret could not read. Thomas looked at Margaret, and in his eyes she saw the same realization she felt. They had done it. Against impossible odds, against powerful men with unlimited resources, against an entire system designed to crush people like them, they had actually done it. But the victory was temporary. Now came the truly difficult part, staying alive long enough to use the evidence they carried. The boatman rowed for 3 hours, navigating by moonlight and instinct, until they reached a small, unnamed landing where he claimed railroad access was possible. He deposited them on shore and immediately departed, wanting no further connection to fugitives who would be hunted intensively. They stood on the muddy bank in the pre-dawn darkness. 6 people with almost no resources, being pursued by men who had every reason to kill them. What now? Ruth asked, her voice steadier now. Where do we go from here? Thomas looked at the others. We need to split up. 6 people traveling together are too noticeable. We cannot all go to Philadelphia. No, Margaret said firmly. We stay together. The documents need multiple witnesses. If something happens to one of us, the others can still testify. We are stronger together than separated. She is right, Daniel said. I have contacts in Philadelphia. Safe houses, abolition society members who will protect us and help present evidence to authorities. But we need corroborating testimony from everyone here. Each of us provides different pieces of the story. Then we go together, James agreed. But we need to move quickly. By sunrise, they will have organized pursuit. They will have descriptions of us sent to every sheriff, every constable, every slave catcher in the region. Thomas nodded. The railroad is 2 miles east. If we can catch the morning freight heading north, we have a chance. They began walking, following a rough path the boatman had indicated. The night was fading toward dawn, sky beginning to lighten in the east. Margaret's feet ached in her delicate boots, designed for parlor floors, not rough country trails. But she ignored the pain and kept walking. As they walked, Daniel asked Thomas about the documents they carried. Thomas explained the folders Margaret had stolen, the evidence they contained. Daniel's face grew grim as he absorbed the implications. This network is larger than I imagined, he said quietly. I thought my kidnapping was opportunistic, criminal, but isolated. But if what you describe is accurate, this is systematic, organized, supported at the highest levels. It has been operating for at least 12 years, Margaret confirmed. Possibly longer. My father's ledgers document hundreds of transactions. How many people? Ruth asked, her voice tight. How many lives destroyed? I do not have exact numbers, Margaret admitted. But based on what I saw, certainly hundreds. Possibly thousands across the entire network. Ruth stopped walking. Thousands of people. Stolen from freedom. Sold into bondage. Their families searching, never knowing what happened. Which is why this evidence matters, Thomas said. Why we must survive to present it. Every person here represents countless others who did not escape, who died in captivity, who will never see justice. We owe them our survival. They walked faster. By the time they reached the railroad tracks, the sun was rising. A small depot stood nearby, barely more than a shack with a telegraph line. A freight train sat on the tracks being loaded with cargo. Workers moved with practiced efficiency, barely glancing at the 6 bedraggled travelers who approached. Thomas studied the train carefully. We need to board without being noticed. No tickets, no official record of our presence. The freight cars, James said, his shipping clerk experience suddenly valuable. 4th car from the engine, the one being loaded with cotton bales. We can hide among the cargo. They waited until the workers took a break, then moved quickly. James led them to the specified car and they climbed inside, burrowing into the spaces between cotton bales. The hiding spot was cramped and uncomfortable, but effectively concealed them from casual observation. 20 minutes later, the train lurched into motion. They were heading north. For the first hour, no one spoke. They simply sat in the darkness among the cotton bales, processing what had happened. Escaped. Actually escaped. The realization felt impossible. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. Thank you. Both of you. For coming back for us. We could not leave you, Margaret said simply. Most people would have. Most people would have protected themselves and abandoned us. You risked everything to free people you did not know. Thomas risked far more than I did, Margaret said. I am a white woman from a wealthy family. Even if caught, there are limits to what they could do to me legally. Thomas? They would kill him, slowly and publicly, as a warning to others. Thomas shrugged. Fear of consequences only matters if you allow it to control your actions. I decided months ago that I would rather die fighting than live in submission. Everything since has simply been following that decision to its logical conclusion. What will you do? Daniel asked him. After we present the evidence, after we destroy the network, what happens to you? I do not know, Thomas admitted. I had a life once. A business, a reputation, a place in my community. That is gone now. Even if technically free again, I cannot simply resume what was taken. Too much has changed. I have changed. Perhaps I will go to Canada. Start fresh somewhere they have never heard of Thomas the Carpenter or the network that destroyed him. Or, Margaret said quietly, perhaps you stay and fight. Testify not just about this network, but about the entire system of slavery. Use your intelligence and anger to advocate for abolition. Your voice matters, Thomas. People need to hear from someone who experienced both freedom and bondage, who can articulate the horror of that transition. Thomas looked at her with an unreadable expression. You speak as if you have plans for us beyond simple survival. I do. We have evidence to destroy one kidnapping network, but that network exists because slavery itself creates the environment for such horrors. We do not stop with exposing your father's conspiracy, Margaret. We use it as ammunition in the larger fight. Daniel nodded slowly. The abolition societies in Philadelphia will support this. The evidence you carry is exactly what we need to counter the narrative that slavery is benign, that enslaved people are content, that the system is justified. Your documentation proves deliberate systematic evil. That cannot be dismissed or rationalized. But will anyone care? James asked bitterly. We are talking about crimes against black people. In my experience, authorities rarely prioritize justice for us, which is why we need Margaret, Ruth said, understanding suddenly. A white woman from a wealthy Southern family, testifying against her own father, presenting evidence of a conspiracy involving judges and politicians. That carries weight. That creates a scandal too large to ignore. Margaret had not thought of herself as particularly valuable to the cause beyond the documents she carried. But Ruth was right. Her testimony, her willingness to betray her class and family, created a narrative abolitionists could use effectively. Then I will testify, she said firmly, to anyone who will listen, as many times as necessary. I will tell the truth about Rosewood Plantation and Edmund Hartwell and the entire monstrous system he represents. The train rattled northward through South Carolina into North Carolina, stopping occasionally at small stations to load or unload cargo. Each stop was terrifying, the possibility of discovery acute. But the workers who briefly entered their car never examined the cotton bales closely enough to find the 6 fugitives hidden among them. As day became evening, they risked eating some of the dried food Ruth had somehow managed to grab during their escape. Not much, but enough to ease the worst hunger. They rationed water carefully from a single canteen James had found in the freight car. That night, exhausted but unable to sleep, Margaret found herself talking quietly with Thomas in the darkness. Do you think we will make it? She asked. Truly? I think we have a better chance than we did yesterday, Thomas said. Every mile north improves our odds. My father will never stop looking for us. No, but his reach has limits. The further from South Carolina we travel, the less power he wields. By the time we reach Philadelphia, we will be in territory where abolitionists have their own power, their own networks. Your father becomes just another Southern planter with no jurisdiction and no authority. Margaret considered this. What if the documents are not enough? What if we present everything and nothing changes? Then at least we tried. At least we bore witness. History will know the truth, even if justice is delayed. Is that enough for you? For your family? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Nothing will be enough for my family. They are gone. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, they died because your father destroyed our lives for profit. No amount of justice can restore what was taken, but perhaps we can prevent the same from happening to others. Perhaps that is the only vengeance available to us. I am sorry, Margaret whispered, for what my father did, for what my family's wealth cost yours. You are not responsible for his actions, only your own, and your actions have been towards justice, not complicity. That matters. They sat in silence as the train continued north through the darkness, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but away from a certain past. Somewhere behind them, Edmund Hartwell was organizing pursuit, mobilizing every resource at his disposal to recapture his daughter and the enslaved people who had destroyed his carefully constructed life. Coulter was likely doing the same, his network's security shattered by the theft of irreplaceable documentation. But ahead of them, if they could survive long enough to reach it, was Philadelphia. Safety, testimony, the possibility of justice. The train rattled on through the night, and 6 fugitives, bound together by chance and necessity, traveled toward the reckoning their captors had never imagined possible. The train crossed into Pennsylvania on December 28th, 3 days after their escape. No one spoke when Thomas, who had been watching through gaps in the freight car walls, announced they had left Virginia behind. But Margaret felt something release in her chest. Pennsylvania, free soil. A state where slavery was illegal, where the law recognized human beings as human beings regardless of color. Except the law was not that simple. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even in free states, enslaved people who escaped could be captured and returned to bondage. And Margaret, Thomas, Ruth, Daniel, and James were all technically fugitives, wanted for theft, escape, and what would certainly be portrayed as violent rebellion. Their safety remained precarious at best. The train arrived at Philadelphia's outskirts on the morning of December 29th. They waited until the freight yard was busy with activity before slipping out of their cotton bale hiding place and exiting the train separately, trying not to attract attention as a group. The city sprawled before them, massive and overwhelming after days of hiding in cramped darkness. Daniel took the lead, using his knowledge of Philadelphia's black community to navigate them toward help. They moved through streets crowded with people, horses, carriages, vendors. The noise and bustle were shocking after the relative isolation of plantation life. Margaret had been to Charleston several times, but Philadelphia was entirely different. Larger, busier, more diverse. Free black people walked openly, conducting business, speaking to white people as equals. It was surreal. After an hour of careful navigation, Daniel led them to a modest building on a side street in a predominantly black neighborhood. A sign above the door read, African Methodist Episcopal Church. Daniel knocked with a specific pattern, 3 quick raps, pause, 2 more. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged black woman with intelligent eyes and an expression that shifted from suspicion to recognition when she saw Daniel. Dr. Morris? My God, we thought you were dead. Your wife has been searching for months. Her eyes moved to the others. Who are these people? Friends who saved my life. Mrs. Henderson, we need immediate help. We are fugitives from South Carolina, pursued by men who will kill us, and we carry evidence of a kidnapping network that has been operating for over a decade. Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. Come inside, quickly. They entered a small office where Mrs. Henderson served as coordinator for the local Underground Railroad station. She listened intently as they explained their situation, her face growing more grim with each detail. You understand what you're asking? She said when they finished. Presenting this evidence means exposing yourselves to public scrutiny. It means testifying in courts, speaking to newspapers, making yourselves targets for men with enormous resources and motivation to silence you. We understand, Margaret said, but we have no choice. This network must be destroyed. Mrs. Henderson studied Margaret carefully. You are white. Wealthy, I assume, based on your clothing. You could walk away from this. Return home, claim you were kidnapped yourself. Your father would likely forgive you to avoid scandal. My father orchestrated the kidnapping and sale of hundreds of free people. He deserves no forgiveness. Even so, you have options these others do not. Margaret thought about this, then shook her head. No, I have the same option they do. Fight or submit. I choose to fight. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. Then we have work to do. First, you all need proper shelter, food, and rest. You look half dead. Then we need to organize the evidence and determine the best approach for presentation. Over the following week, housed in a safe location coordinated by the Underground Railroad network, they did exactly that. Margaret, Thomas, and the others organized the stolen documents methodically. They created summaries of the most damaging evidence. They prepared written testimonies describing their experiences. They identified network members by name and location. The documents were even more devastating than they had initially realized. The folders Margaret had stolen contained not just information about Edmund Hartwell's operations, but records of the entire Southern network. Names of corrupt officials in Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, and Louisiana. Financial records showing payments to judges, sheriffs, ship captains, and slave dealers. Detailed descriptions of methodology, from initial target selection through final sale. One folder contained correspondence between Coulter and a network member in New Orleans discussing the murder of a free black woman who had resisted too effectively and become too risky to sell. They had killed her and dumped her body in the bayou, then informed her searching family that she had died of yellow fever. The letter discussed this casually, as one might discuss disposing of spoiled merchandise. Ruth read that letter and had to leave the room. When she returned, her eyes were hard. Every person who wrote these letters, who participated in this system, needs to face consequences, not just criminal prosecution, public exposure. I want their names in newspapers. I want their reputations destroyed. I want them to know what it feels like to have everything taken away. That is what we are working toward. Mrs. Henderson assured her. But we must be strategic. The abolition societies will help, but they need your testimony to be airtight. They need evidence that cannot be dismissed or rationalized. William Still, a prominent abolitionist and chairman of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's Vigilance Committee, arrived on January 4th to review their materials. He was a serious man in his mid-30s, meticulous in his documentation of Underground Railroad activities. He spent hours examining the documents, asking detailed questions, verifying information against records he maintained of disappeared free black people. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "I have documented over 40 cases of free people who vanished from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston over the past 10 years. At least 18 are mentioned in your papers. We have been searching for answers, and you have brought us those answers complete with perpetrators' identities. What happens now?" Thomas asked. "Now we make this public in a way that cannot be ignored. I have contacts at several newspapers, both abolitionist publications and mainstream papers. We need to place this story where it creates maximum impact. Simultaneously, we file legal complaints against every identified network member. We petition Congress for investigation. We make enough noise that even people who prefer to ignore slavery's evils cannot avoid this." "Will it work?" Margaret asked. "Will anyone care?" Still looked at her steadily. "Some will care. Others will dismiss it as abolitionist propaganda. Still others will actively work to suppress it because acknowledging the truth would require them to question systems they benefit from. But here is what matters. The truth will be documented, preserved, available for future generations. Even if justice is imperfect now, history will know what happened." The first article appeared in The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, on January 15, 1837. The headline read, "Systematic Kidnapping Network Exposed, Hundreds of Free Citizens Sold into Slavery." The article detailed the network's operations, named specific perpetrators including Edmund Hartwell and Abraham Coulter, and included excerpts from the stolen documents. Margaret's testimony was featured prominently. Her willingness to expose her own father presented as evidence of the conspiracy's undeniable truth. The response was immediate and explosive. Other newspapers picked up the story. Some abolitionist publications ran it verbatim. Some mainstream papers published skeptical versions, questioning the authenticity of the documents. Southern newspapers denounced it as Northern propaganda, claiming the entire story was fabricated to damage the South's reputation. But the documentation was too detailed, too specific, too corroborated by multiple witnesses for easy dismissal. The Pennsylvania Attorney General announced investigation into the kidnapping allegations. Federal prosecutors began examining potential violations of laws prohibiting slave trading. Families of disappeared loved ones came forward, their testimonies matching names and descriptions in the documents. Edmund Hartwell responded by filing legal claims asserting that Margaret was mentally unstable, that she had been manipulated by abolitionists, that Thomas had kidnapped her and forced her cooperation. He demanded her return to South Carolina for medical treatment. Several Southern politicians supported his claims, presenting Margaret as a victim rather than a whistleblower. But Margaret refused to be silenced. On January 28th, she testified before a special investigative committee convened by the Pennsylvania legislature. Her testimony was public, recorded by stenographers, and published in multiple newspapers. She described growing up at Rosewood Plantation. She described discovering her father's ledgers. She described the systematic kidnapping and sale of free people. She described the network's protection by corrupt officials. And she described her decision to expose it all, framing her choice not as betrayal of family, but as loyalty to truth and justice. "My father taught me that character is defined by difficult choices," she said in her testimony. "He taught me that integrity means standing by principles even when costly. He did not realize he was teaching me the very values that would lead me to oppose him. I regret that my father is a criminal. I regret that my family's wealth was built on systematic evil. But I do not regret exposing that evil. Truth matters more than family loyalty. Justice matters more than preserving comfortable lies." The testimony was reprinted across the North. Abolition societies used it in their advocacy materials. Margaret Hartwell became both celebrated and vilified, depending on one's perspective regarding slavery. Thomas testified as well, describing his kidnapping in Baltimore, his sale through the network, his discovery of the conspiracy's scope. His testimony was detailed, technical, focused on evidence rather than emotion. But when asked why he risked everything to expose the network, his answer was simple. Because they took everything from me. My freedom, my business, my dignity. They believed they could destroy a human being without consequence. I am here to prove they were wrong. Ruth, Daniel, and James each provided their own testimonies, corroborating the documentation, adding personal experiences that gave human context to the abstract horror of the records. The legal consequences unfolded slowly but steadily. Abraham Coulter was arrested in New York on February 3rd, charged with kidnapping and human trafficking. He posted bail and immediately fled, disappearing completely. Most believe he went to Europe, living under an assumed identity until his death. Judge Carvel in South Carolina was investigated, but never prosecuted. His connections protected him legally, though his reputation was permanently damaged. He retired from the bench within a year and died in 1842, some say by his own hand. Edmund Hartwell faced the most aggressive prosecution. Pennsylvania issued warrants for his arrest on kidnapping charges. South Carolina refused to honor the warrants, claiming they were politically motivated attacks on Southern institutions. But Edmund could never safely travel north again, effectively confining him to slave states for the remainder of his life. More importantly, his reputation was destroyed. Other plantation owners avoided association with him, fearing contamination by the scandal. His business dealings collapsed. The network he had been part of dissolved as members scrambled to distance themselves from exposure. Rosewood Plantation fell into decline, eventually sold to pay debts in 1843. Edmund Hartwell died in 1849, alone and bankrupt, in a boarding house in Mobile, Alabama. Margaret learned of his death through a brief newspaper notice. She felt no satisfaction, just exhausted sadness that so much destruction had been necessary. But the broader impact of their exposure extended far beyond individual prosecutions. The documented evidence of systematic kidnapping became powerful ammunition in the abolition movement's arguments against slavery itself. How could the institution be benign, abolitionists argued, when it created economic incentives for kidnapping free people? How could slave owners be trusted stewards of human beings when they participated in or tolerated such atrocities? The documents also provided concrete evidence for researchers and historians studying the period. Where previous accounts of kidnapping had been dismissed as anecdotal or exaggerated, the Hartwell Papers, as they became known, offered systematic documentation that could not be easily dismissed. Margaret never returned to South Carolina. She remained in Philadelphia, where she worked with the Anti-Slavery Society for the rest of her life. She never married, never sought to rebuild the wealth and social position she had abandoned. She lived modestly, dedicating herself entirely to abolition advocacy and assisting the Underground Railroad. She maintained detailed correspondence with activists across the North, became a skilled public speaker despite her initial nervousness, and wrote extensively about her experiences. Her writings were published in various abolitionist newspapers and collected in a book in 1851 titled Testimony, A Daughter's Account of Slavery's Corruption. Thomas rebuilt his carpentry business in Philadelphia, though it took years to reestablish his reputation and clientele. He became financially successful again, using his resources to support anti-slavery work and assist other victims of kidnapping who managed to escape. He never spoke publicly about his time at Rosewood unless specifically asked, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But he and Margaret remained close friends until her death in 1871. They met regularly, coordinating various projects, supporting each other through difficult times. Some people speculated about the nature of their relationship, and certainly there was deep affection between them. But whether that affection was romantic or simply the profound bond between people who had survived something terrible together, no one could say for certain. They never discussed it publicly. Ruth Campbell returned to New York and resumed teaching. Though she never truly recovered from her kidnapping experience, she suffered nightmares for years and struggled with trusting people. But she channeled her trauma into fierce advocacy for abolition and women's rights, becoming a prominent voice in both movements. She lived until 1888, long enough to see slavery abolished and to witness the early struggles of Reconstruction. Daniel Morris reunited with his wife and resumed his medical practice in Philadelphia. He became particularly focused on treating formerly enslaved people who had suffered physical and psychological trauma, developing innovative approaches to what we would now call post-traumatic stress. He wrote extensively about the medical impacts of slavery, arguing that the institution caused measurable physiological and psychological damage that could be documented and studied. James Patterson struggled the most with adjustment after escape. He was the youngest of the group, and his kidnapping had shattered his trust in the world. He attempted to resume work in shipping, but found himself unable to function in environments that reminded him of the docks where he had been captured. Eventually, he moved to a rural area in western Pennsylvania, where he became a farmer, living quietly and avoiding attention. He died in 1852 at age 38, some believe by suicide, though records are unclear. The story of their escape and exposure of the network became part of abolitionist mythology, told and retold in lectures, articles, and conversations. Some details were exaggerated over time, some were simplified, but the core truth remained. A plantation owner's daughter and an enslaved man had conspired against impossible odds to expose a kidnapping network that had operated with impunity for over a decade. The network itself never fully recovered. While individual kidnappings continued, the systematic, organized operation that Coulter had coordinated was shattered. The exposure made it too risky for corrupt officials to participate openly. Ship captains became more cautious. Slave dealers faced increased scrutiny. It did not end kidnapping, but it made it harder, riskier, less profitable. And sometimes, that is all justice can achieve in an unjust system. The documents Margaret stole remained in the possession of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society until 1865, when they were donated to the Library Company of Philadelphia. They are still there today, preserved in climate-controlled storage, available to researchers studying the history of slavery and the networks that sustained it. Historians continue to reference the Hartwell Papers when documenting the scope of kidnapping practices in the antebellum period. The materials provide rare primary source evidence of criminal networks that usually left no documentation. Students studying this dark chapter of American history often encounter Margaret's testimony, Thomas's statements, and the meticulously maintained records of men who believed their crimes would never be discovered. On The Sealed Room, we explore these forgotten corners of history, these stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about the past. The story of Margaret Hartwell and Thomas, of Ruth, Daniel, and James, reminds us that resistance to evil has always existed, even when systems seemed unbreakable. What fascinates me most about this case is not just the horror of the kidnapping network itself, though that horror was profound. It is the courage required to oppose it. Margaret had to betray everything she had been taught about family loyalty and social position. Thomas had to risk death for the possibility of justice. Ruth, Daniel, and James had to trust people they had no reason to trust after everything they had suffered. And they succeeded not because they were extraordinary people, though they were, certainly brave, but because they refused to accept that power made right. They insisted that truth mattered, even when speaking it was dangerous. They demonstrated that systems of oppression, no matter how entrenched, contain vulnerabilities that determined people can exploit. The network that kidnapped free black people and sold them into slavery relied on silence. It relied on victims being isolated, unable to gather evidence or reach sympathetic authorities. It relied on complicity from officials who benefited from the system. It relied on the assumption that people like Margaret would always protect their own class interests, that people like Thomas would remain broken by trauma, that resistance was impossible. But Margaret refused to protect her class. Thomas refused to stay broken. And together, with 3 people they freed along the way, they shattered that network's assumptions completely. Their victory was imperfect. Many network members escaped prosecution. The broader institution of slavery continued until 1865. Countless people kidnapped by the network were never recovered, never freed, died in bondage. Justice delayed is justice denied, and for many victims, justice came too late or not at all. But the documentation survived. The testimony was recorded. The truth was preserved. And while that does not undo the suffering, it ensures the suffering is not forgotten. It ensures that future generations know what happened, know who was responsible, know that resistance was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Sometimes that is all we can ask of history, not perfect justice, not complete victory, just the preservation of truth against those who would prefer comfortable lies. The kidnapping network that Edmund Hartwell participated in was not unique. Similar operations existed across the South, targeting free black people for decades. Some were exposed, most were not. The Hartwell case stands out primarily because the documentation survived, because witnesses escaped to tell the story, because Margaret's testimony provided the credibility that allegations from black witnesses alone could not achieve in that era. That last point is worth dwelling on. Thomas, Ruth, Daniel, and James all provided detailed, accurate testimony about their kidnapping and enslavement. But their voices alone, as black people accusing white men of crimes, would likely have been dismissed. It was Margaret's testimony, a white woman from a slave-owning family, that gave the accusations weight in a racist legal system. This reality is itself an indictment of the society that required such validation. That the truth needed to be spoken by someone from the oppressor class to be believed reveals the fundamental corruption of the system. But Margaret understood this, and rather than resenting the burden, she used her privilege strategically to amplify voices that would otherwise have been silenced. That is perhaps her most important legacy, not just that she exposed her father, but that she recognized her own position in an unjust hierarchy and chose to weaponize that position against the hierarchy itself. She understood that privilege can be deployed for justice as easily as for oppression, that refusing to use advantages for good is itself a moral failure. Today, the site where Rosewood Plantation once stood is farmland, unremarkable and anonymous. No historical marker notes what happened there. The buildings are long gone, destroyed by fire in 1847 in what may have been arson by freed people who remembered what had occurred in those structures. The new building Edmund had constructed for document storage, the building where Margaret and Thomas freed Ruth, Daniel, and James, was dismantled in 1844 and its materials sold. Nothing remains of the physical structures that housed so much suffering. But the documents survive. The testimonies survive. The truth survives. And sometimes, when history is honest with itself, that must be enough. What do you think about this story? Does it change how you understand the complexity of slavery and resistance in the antebellum South? Have you heard of similar cases where documentation survived to preserve truth that would otherwise have been lost? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe in preserving difficult histories that challenge comfortable narratives, subscribe to The Sealed Room. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the forgotten, suppressed, and deliberately obscured corners of American history. These stories are not entertainment. They are evidence. They are testimony. They are the voices of people who fought against impossible odds to ensure truth survived. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the best way to honor people like Margaret, Thomas, Ruth, Daniel, and James is to ensure their resistance, their courage, their refusal to be silenced, continues to inspire future generations who face their own impossible battles against entrenched injustice. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth. And sometimes it is the only thing worth doing. See you in the next investigation.